I don't care what you look like or what you think. I don't care what you do or where you're from. All I care about is that gift hidden inside you. And all I want to do is help it come alive. Because where we're going, we're going to need a lot of heroes. For the record, 10,000 Heroes is brought to you by Momentum Lab. The point of Momentum Lab is to turn idealists into impactors by aligning your dreams and aspirations with success in every area of your life today. Momentum Lab is like a playground for your highest self. We take your dreams seriously and help you remove any blocks to realizing them. We do this through courses, virtual events, in-person events, and our signature year-long accelerator. To join our world, engage in dialogue, meet up in person, and just blow your mind, sign up at momentumlab.com. Hey everybody, and welcome back to another episode of 10,000 Heroes. I'm your host, Ankur Shah Delight, and today is an interview episode with Josh Morrison, who's the co-founder of an organization called Frolic. And Frolic is a housing organization working to pave the way for thousands of new multifamily housing cooperatives all along the US. And so when I hear multifamily housing cooperative, I think community, and that's exactly where we're at. We're in this stretch. We're talking about community. Last week we had Shilpa on to talk about building community, different forms. We'll have a few other people in the next few weeks like that. And this is building community on an institutional level. But what's really interesting about our talk is, I thought I was just going to get all of this love and purpose about how it's going to be great to live together. But Josh first presented me with a sordid history of housing segregation and racialized housing policies in the United States that I had no idea about, although I guess you could have guessed it. But it's really, that part is dark, but very educational. And it's all about intentionally avoiding and preventing community. And then we get to the place of like, all right, what does it mean to build these multifamily housing cooperatives? And how are those intentionally doing the opposite? So most of the time we're in these unintentional communities. We live in close to people we don't know. We have this history of unintentional and like implemented, forced unintentional community. And then there's this future he's offering us of really thoughtful, introspective, intentional community. So that's the trajectory as how I saw it. Love to hear what you guys think. All right. Thank you. Okay, Josh, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So what I'd like to do today, like I'm seeing this as like a dinner party, which I actually talked about on my podcast last week, the importance of dinner parties in a kind of separate vein than this. But let's have the appetizer be this actual project that you're doing that I find a little bit intriguing and a little bit confusing. And then the main dish will be like why you're doing something like this and what is the kind of the deeper motivations and inspiration that goes into it.
Okay, cool. That sounds great.
Yeah.
One of the things that is that kind of a framing of what we're doing that I find helpful as I've been thinking about it a lot is in the 30s, the government, the Federal Housing Administration that FDR set up, created a program to try to get a lot of Americans into homeownership. That they started insuring the 30-year mortgage, and that it kind of started in the 30s and 40s and 50s and evolved, and it really was the foundation for a lot of the middle class in America. That ability to enter into homeownership. Prior to that, if you wanted to buy a home, you needed to get a loan that would last 7 years, and you had to put 50% of it down, which was tough for a lot of people. So it really changed. It changed the whole homeownership market in the US and really the economy and people's relationships to home.
Wow. Okay. So just even for that, if I could get into that a little bit, like I'm thinking about the kind of complaining I did when I had to put 20% down, which was a big stretch and I needed family help to do that.
Yeah.
So you're saying before that it was 50% down and the balance in 7 years.
So in 7 years, you didn't build any equity during that time. So if you didn't succeed in paying off that loan, you wouldn't own any of your home. The bank would. You didn't actually have the deed on your house. So the 30-year insured mortgage that the Federal Housing Administration created under FDR was huge. It totally changed everything. And what was important about that, looking historically at and kind of currently at the situation we are in now, is that that program explicitly excluded Black home buyers. It would only insure mortgages to homes sold to white people, and that's what the whole the whole history of redlining was that system that the Federal Housing Administration created in partnership with appraisers to color code neighborhoods. And if a neighborhood was above a certain percentage of Black families, if it was above 5% or so, the neighborhood would get a red line around it. And the government would say, we will never insure a mortgage in this neighborhood because it's not segregated. There's a mixing of races, and that's going to be bad for property values in the long term. That was their opinion at that time. And that was through the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And so that's like, that for me, I believe is very much the foundation of the racial wealth gap that we have today, is that difference in what white families had accessible to them and what the middle class was composed of, for 3 decades and 4 decades, kind of onwards, it took different forms. But that history is deeply important to the situation that we have now.
Yeah. So the whole racism in the home buying field and the real estate field, I always saw it as like, yeah, it's unfortunate. We're going to have to fight against it. It's going to slowly improve. But this was actually like built into it from the beginning. So it's not just like a little hangover.
It's structural, and it's structural in a way that it was enforced segregation through the policy of the federal government. And what it meant was that white families were able to access wealth at a time, and it happened both with access to this insurance for mortgages, so being able to buy a home, but it also there was all the mass building of suburbs happened during this period of time, especially post World War II. And those suburbs were built on loans that were insured by the same agency, the Federal Housing Administration. But the insurance of those big loans, these are, like massive loans to build 1,000 homes in a new neighborhood. You think of a lot of the suburbs we know today of cities. Those loans were only given if those developments had covenants written into them that they would never sell to a Black family. So all of that new housing that was built, you couldn't buy, if you were not white, you couldn't buy those homes. And what it meant was for Black families to buy a home, they had to do what was called a contract for deed, which is they would end up paying often 20% or 30% more than what a market value of a home would be, because there were so few options for them to access. And then they would enter into these extremely predatory loans that were the only ones they could get, where the bank owned your entire home throughout the entire process of you paying. The interest rates were much higher, 10 to 20%. And if you missed a single payment, you would be evicted and you wouldn't own anything because the bank held the deed. There's a really, really innovative and incredible team called Black Star Stability that's working on this exact issue. But if you think about now going forward 80 years, 90 years, what you have, like what you're talking about, how difficult it is to put a down payment on a home if you are from a white family, or if your parents have been able to access homeownership. Your situation, or their parents have been able to access homeownership, your situation is so dramatically different from someone whose parents and grandparents have been renting, or have had housing insecurity.
Yeah, and if I understand correctly, that was the original intention of this FDR thing, was to narrow the class gap and this difference between intergenerational wealth, like before, but only for white people.
Yeah, it was. This part of it was a reaction to the Red Scare and fear of communism, and the idea that getting people into homeownership was a way of kind of investing them in the capitalist system, that if you own your home. But that was like in the 20s. And it wasn't until FDR created this program that it really took off, homeownership. The idea of like the American dream of buying a home in the suburbs and owning, So
that wasn't a thing, like say 110 years ago.
Not at all. It was rare to own a home. And yeah, it was kind of seen as the pillar. And you think of it now, your home is so much, people who are lucky enough to own a home, it's very much the social safety net in a way. It's like what you can use to borrow against to pay for education or for health emergencies. It's like people who have that sort of capital and wealth behind them have a very different safety net than people who don't.
Yeah. And it's highly subsidized, like in order to, because I was thinking about this the other day.
It is.
It doesn't really make sense to buy a house, versus rent. In some ways, like financially, when I looked at what I was paying for rent before I bought a house, it's like my payment is way more now. Like I was trying to like do like an actual rational cost benefit analysis. It wouldn't have penciled out. There's just something mythical that I just felt like I'm going to have a kid. I need to own a home.
Yeah, it's very built into our culture. That's kind of a necessary part of. But it's also not just that. I think it is. There's the fear of housing insecurity is real. It's something that is happening. The prices of like rents are going up. They continue to as people urbanize, and then the fact that you never know when your landlord will sell is a sort of stressor that lives somewhere in your psyche that doesn't really go away. Like how you invest in your neighbors or in your relationships to your neighbors and to your school, and like not knowing if at some point you're going to have to move is really hard.
Yeah. And so the ability to take out this really subsidized loan and then buy a house for something around the cost per month of what you were paying for rent, if you're able to get access to this chunk up front. So if you have the intergenerational wealth or
it's kind of the crazy thing is a lot of people are renting and they're paying someone else's loan off that bought that home they live in.
Sure. Yeah.
They're paying the same payments they would if they owned the house, but they're renting and they're not saving that money. Which is like they could afford to buy it, but they just don't have that chunk. There's that barrier. And that barrier, that class divide, I feel between people who own and people who rent is getting deeper and deeper. It's as it becomes more expensive to rent. I think I read a statistic recently that over 40% of Americans are rent burdened.
What does that mean? Rent burdened?
Rent burdened is that you're spending more than a third of your income essentially on your housing, on rent. And it means that you're not really able to save money. Like you're spending so much on your housing that you're not able to create a savings. And that just, it makes it harder and harder over time for people who rent to make that jump from renting into ownership. If you think of that as a chasm that's growing. That started through really structural policies that were explicit. And you think of the racial wealth gap today, it is a dramatic chasm. And if you don't have parents that can help you with a down payment or a cosign on a loan, it's very, very difficult to make that journey, to make that jump. So all of that is to say is what we are doing, our project and what Frolic is about, is really creating an opportunity to create a bridge for people that have been renting generationally to move into ownership, into housing security, and into the ability to have your earnings that you put towards housing not all disappear, but start building wealth for you. And it's about the feeling of permanence. It's about the structural foundation for rooting and all that does for your mental health, for your quality of life, for your ability to invest in the people around you, to see your future and have agency over your future. And like connected to your podcast and sort of what you're focused on and talking about is like your ability to dream and to follow your calling. It's like so much of that is feeling rooted and feeling safe.
Mm-hmm. So how does it, it's beautiful. I mean, I love the idea. How does it work? I mean, well, maybe even before we get there, just now in this kind of, the remote work has really taken off in the last 20 years.
Yeah.
The pandemic has really shuffled around where people are living and driven up real estate values, places that before wasn't so high. So I can see like even increased need for this. Like I live in this small town, and many people who grew up in this town, like I did, cannot afford to live here. Mm-hmm. Because like the jobs that are available locally, unless you're at like the high, the upper echelon of just being a doctor or something, are just not going to compete with like the remote work that people are, they're working for some tech company, but then, which is I think it's a great financial decision to like get paid a Seattle salary and then like live in some rural area. You're going to get a great buy, But what the consequences of that is the people that live in that rural area that don't have access to that urban salary are going to have a really hard time finding housing. So I think in addition to everything you're saying that's been true for the last 100 years, there's also this moment in the last 10 years of even increased angst and demand over this issue.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. And there's also been a weird thing that happened during the pandemic, that wealth was even further concentrated. And housing being one of the places that people put capital from an investment standpoint meant that a lot of capital moved into real estate. And that made, a lot of homes were bought up by private equity companies and investment companies. And the amount of home ownership actually of individuals declined a lot during the pandemic. And that sort of trend of putting capital in housing has also exacerbated that issue. Yeah. So
what's the tool then to cross the chasm?
Yeah. So what we're doing, which is actually not so complicated, is building cooperatives, housing cooperatives. And the co-op, when you hear co-op, you often think of like college co-ops where everyone lives together. And that is, you can do a lot of things cooperatively. When we talk about co-ops, we're really focused on the ownership, the method of ownership. And co-ops as a way of owning basically an apartment, not a single family home, but a home in a multifamily project. It predates condos. It's basically like co-ops existed before condos did, and when the idea of a condo was created, it kind of replaced co-ops as an ownership method. But you have places like New York where there's thousands of co-ops, and it's very common. And basically, a co-op is it's if you have a project with 10 units, and then you have a co-op that owns it, and each person who owns their unit owns a share in the co-op. It's basically like a company where there's 10 shares. Each share represents one of the units, and you all own the whole thing together. You own your unit, and you also own the entire project together. What is unique about co-ops that doesn't exist in condos, and is why we're very excited about creating co-ops right now, is that you can have 2 layers of debt. So that's like a technical thing, but to break it down,
doesn't sound good so far.
Well, it's basically like you can have a mortgage to buy your home, but then you can all share a mortgage for the whole project. And that bigger mortgage is taken by the project, the co-op, by the company, and not the individual.
Okay.
And because there's those 2 layers, it means that the amount of cash you have to put forward to buy your home is significantly lower. So our down payments on our homes are between $10,000 and $30,000 compared to Seattle. Typical down payments are above $100,000.
Yeah.
And what we're trying to do is get within earshot of a typical renter's upfront costs of, first and last month's rent and security deposit, which we aren't quite there, but
that would be amazing. That's like dreamy.
Yeah. And the idea is that this kind of provides a bridge for people who have been renting that don't have that wealth, but they're able to get a foothold. As an owner of a co-op unit, you're basically, it's almost like you're renting from a building that you own, except that there's no one making profit off of it. You're the owner. So it's run at cost. So your rent is not going to grow. Like, it's not going to increase with the rest of the market. And you will build for our projects, about half of what people are paying each month is part of their equity. It's savings that they're going to get when they move, when they leave. So you're not building wealth at the pace you would in the conventional, like if you were to buy a single family home, but you are building wealth, and you're putting aside a good portion of what you're paying each month into equity, which we see as a way for people to make that bridge. If they live in a co-op for 5 or 10 years, they'll have enough equity probably to do a down payment on a house if they wanted to get one. But either way, they have access to security, knowing that they can live there forever if they want to. They can pass it on to their children and their grandchildren, and that their monthly expenses are not going to increase. So if they feel like our projects, the monthly costs are pretty close to market rent for someone moving into them, a bit higher, but pretty close. In 10 years, that's going to feel very, very low compared to market rent based on what we've seen in the last, 20 years. Even with the down, the 2009 crash and different moments, rents have continued to increase. So that's really exciting for us, is creating that opportunity. And that's from a purely economic justice standpoint. There's also everything we're doing with design and community, from the actual spaces. And so there's a lot to talk about there. But at a base level, allowing people to access the safety and security of ownership is a huge driver of what we're doing.
Yeah. And okay, I'd love to talk about the community piece in a bit, but I just want to complete this puzzle. And I love math, so I could go all into it, but maybe just keep it at a high level. Who's paying the rest of the down payment?
So if you think about a good way to think about it is, if you had, for example, a 4-unit condo, and it cost $4 million, that condo. You have to sell each condo for $1 million. So each person would have to come up with $1 million to buy it. But as a co-op, that condo can take a $2 million loan together, a blanket loan. And then each person, instead of having to buy $1 million, they're having to buy something that's $500,000.
So there's a different kind of loan available for the co-ops.
Yeah, for the co-op shares. You get a mortgage on your share, and then you have a shared mortgage. And so if you think about where is that other cost going, it's being paid for by a loan that the whole project is taking.
That didn't require a down payment.
The down payment for that loan is the shares people are purchasing. So it's like another way to think about it is, say that you wanted to buy a house, and you wanted to buy it with 10 of your friends or 5 of your friends. You all wanted to buy a house together. And the down payment was $100,000, and you were 5 people. So you each came with $20,000.
Yeah. And
then what if you could get a loan on that $20,000? So you actually didn't have to have $20,000. You only had to have $2,000, but you could get a loan for the rest of it. That's kind of another way of thinking about it. So you're getting one shared mortgage altogether, but then you're each putting in a piece of that, and that piece you can get a mortgage for as well.
Yeah. Okay. So that's really helpful in terms of the broad strokes. And so
there's also some diagrams on our website, which maybe is helpful too.
Okay. Yeah, and we'll put those in the show notes for sure. What is Frolic? Does it just organize that process?
Our vision is that this can become a dominant form of housing in the country, that thousands of these can get built across the country. And how we see it is that development it's kind of like putting together different puzzle pieces. And what a developer is doing is putting those puzzle pieces together. So you have land, you have capital financing, and you have the design, the construction, the permitting. And in the case of a co-op, you have the whole legal structure. And what we are doing is we find that a lot of people would be doing development, but they're missing 1 or 2 of those puzzle pieces. And what we've created is a system to provide the missing puzzle pieces for people to do development that might not otherwise not have. And a good example of this is that all of our upcoming projects are working with homeowners that have land that want to redevelop their land. So they're coming with land. And they, live on lots that have been rezoned for greater density. And they are getting approached by developers constantly wanting to buy their land, but they don't want to leave their neighborhoods. They want to stay in their neighborhoods. And they're seeing that, their community is getting displaced. Their children have no way to ever buy a home in the city. So they see it, they have this question, what if I developed my own land and created more housing on it? And we are helping them do that by bringing the construction, the permitting, the co-op ownership system, the financing, and kind of filling in those other pieces. And the same can be said of, architects that want to do development that have a lot of the expertise, but not necessarily the relationship with lenders, or just the experience of seeing a project through. So that's kind of just at a bigger level is allowing more people to engage with development, and reducing friction for this to happen more. And then we are right now building demonstration projects to showcase how it all works, because in order for other people to do this, they have to see it kind of modeled. So we have we currently have 3 projects in development in Seattle, in Beacon Hill, in Columbia City, and in Central District. And we have 36 homeowners on our wait list for next projects. We're planning to do a batch of 10 projects in the next 3 years from that larger group. And then we recently got a grant from the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative to expand to California. So we're going to do 3 pilots in California this year, are adapting a lot of the systems that we've created in Washington to work with in California.
Okay. All right. So if you didn't have the community piece, if you didn't care about people like hanging out and developing relationships and bonds and all that, and maybe, I don't know if the loan structure would work the same, but you could apply the same idea to just a block and develop a block of a bunch of like single family homes with like fences around them, but still get the housing equity part. Is that true?
It's not totally, I mean, it is. And there's also just a question of math. Like you think of, so zoning has historically, when I talked about sort of the ways that Black and brown families were kept out of neighborhoods through racial covenants, when those covenants were deemed no longer legal, zoning was one of the primary tools for keeping segregation in neighborhoods. And one of the ways that was used was to prevent the development of multifamily housing in certain areas. And the way that played out was just that it's cheaper to buy an apartment or a smaller unit than it is to buy a single family home with a yard. And that's just like pure economics of land plus construction. If you're building a single detached structure, it's a lot more expensive. So part of what we actually see as important is what does it look like to live with, that there's a huge need for people to own something that isn't a single family home with a yard and a lot of space, but actually is maybe a 1, 2, or 3 bedroom unit within a project. But the projects that we're building are smaller, so that they're 6 to 10 units. They're very ground related. They look a lot like single family homes, but they're kind of like cottage developments where people should have a common space but have their own unit. And you could do that same ownership structure in a bigger area, absolutely. And we are looking at doing that with some of our partners. But they're not going to be as affordable as the other units that we're building.
Yeah. That makes sense. But I can just imagine that like there's millions of people out there that aren't as obsessed with community as you or I, but they're like, damn, I'm just excluded from this game. And I want to start building wealth and building equity and not just paying rent. Some other alternate version of Frolic would serve their needs, and they'd be like, okay.
Yeah, totally. Yes. And we're also looking at how to convert both rental property, like multifamily rental, and just rental into cooperative ownership as like another phase. Yeah.
Okay. Awesome. Just kind of curious about that. And it just keeps coming back over and over through your, the history that you're sharing with me. Just the power and the desire for segregation. It's just like this deep.
I mean, yeah, it's interesting
like,
because
so intense.
What's fascinating about the history of it, and this is extremely well documented in the book The Color of Law, which I highly recommend. And what's interesting about that history of segregation and what you're talking about is that I don't actually believe it's as strong with individuals. I think that this policy that was enforced federally, deep-seated fear of integration, because what would happen was if a Black family was able to move into a neighborhood, it would trigger a change in the color status of that neighborhood, where all of their neighbors suddenly wouldn't be able, if they were to sell their homes, buyers wouldn't be able to get this insurance from the federal government. And so their property values would be affected by that. There's this whole blockbusting history of, companies trying to get people to feel the fear of the neighborhood shifting its racial composition.
And that's true from the moment that the FHA loans start until you didn't say this part of the story, but at some point that was like illegal.
That's true. At some point that's shifted, but that's idea that in a racially integrated neighborhood is bad for property values is like, that's a very deep-seated idea. And if you think about what homeownership is for people and their property values are for their family's wealth, like it's a kind of a twisted social experiment that happened through that mortgage insurance program that made people even people who are not maybe inclined to fear integration, to feel like, hey, if my neighbor sells their home to a Black family, it could ruin my like grandkids' prospects of a brighter future, no matter who I am.
Wow.
Which is just like, that messes with people and that sits with people. It's like you learn to fear integration even though you don't really know why.
Mm-hmm. If there's even a small risk that I've put all my finances and all my investment in this one basket, which is my home.
Yeah.
And if there's a small risk that something I do or approve or allow is going to destroy that, when I've just tried to get out of that whole like history of not having wealth and I'm just finally trying to build something, of course I'm gonna want to protect that, even against my like ethical framework.
Yeah, I don't know. There's a lot to say about racism and like there's so many causes and so many ways that it's reinforced structurally now. I just think that history is a piece of it. It's something that hasn't disappeared. And it's still, there's been a lot coming out about the whole appraisal industry recently, and the practice of Black families hiring white people to be there at the time an appraiser comes to value their property or at the time of a sale, and having their homes be appraised, 30% higher when a white person is showing it to an appraiser versus themselves. There's been a lot of news coming out about that, and actually the Biden administration has been doing a lot to change the regulations around the appraisal process, because there's a lot of deep-seated sort of structural racism built into the way that appraisals are done.
You mean now, like 2020?
Right now.
Oh,
yeah. So that's an example of that as well. It's like that idea that of property value and race are being deeply intertwined is still present. So yeah, another really great book is The Sum of Us, by Heather McGhee. It's about, I think the subtitle is How Racism Hurts All of Us. But it's an incredible history of the ways that racism has really hurt poor white people throughout history, and sort of how the commons have deteriorated because of people's fear of integration. The example that kind of the metaphor that goes through a lot of that book is the idea of public pools that were, when they were forced to be integrated, a lot of cities around the country closed their public pools and created private pools and filled them with concrete. I think it was like over 140 pools around the country. So rather than integrate their pools, a lot of people just lost access to this really precious public resource. And that kind of has played out in so many other ways of rather than having a good social welfare system or access to things, rather than sharing those things, there's a lot of political pressure to remove them instead. But her book is great because it kind of oscillates between these stories that are unbelievably frustrating and angering, and then examples of how racial solidarity has led to huge gains for a lot of people. That when unions have brought different races together, that they've made huge gains and have kind of moved past the sort of classic ways that race is used to divide kind of people that are living at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder.
Yeah, that'd be very helpful for me to have some of those examples in there.
Yeah, and it's, I think, like in some ways that's also kind of core to what we see is that what we want to create is access to, it's something that's inspired by the structural failures of the system that we have currently today and the way that our society has been divided, but that those solutions will be really beneficial to a lot of people. It's not just Black and brown people that need access to home ownership. It's a lot of people around the country, and that a lot of things that that our projects can become a more sort of inclusive and whole and human and kind version of the American dream, kind of in the future, that a lot of different people can have access to a stable community. And so that's kind of, I don't know, that helps me feel hope. I think not just what we're doing, there's a lot of really, really great things happening in the country right now that are touching on these themes.
Yeah, no, it seems really important that you're tied in, not just to like the sordid history, but the other people who are acting in concert with you to bring us out of it.
Yeah. Just to name a few, Parody out of Baltimore, Bree Jones, who started Parody, is like, I think, going to be a historical figure. And they're doing incredible work buying up dilapidated blocks in Baltimore and bringing in cohorts of 30 families at a time to kind of reinvigorate a street that was kind of written off. And the Guild out of Atlanta, Georgia, is doing incredible work with cooperative ownership and economic justice. And there's a lot of people doing great things, but those are like two that have been really deeply inspiring for us.
Awesome. Yeah, that's great. I'm sure like lots of listeners will want to read those books and look up those people. So thank you for mentioning that.
Yeah.
So let's go to the community piece. So there's a reason why you focused on in multifamily houses. So why is that?
So throughout all of human history, except this last 250 years, humans have lived in multi-generational communities and have parented in multi-generational communities with a lot of different adults around, and have shared a lot more than we do currently. And a lot of my own personal experience and research throughout my life has been better understanding what this means for people, and how nourishing it is to have more proximate community. I think everyone felt this really strongly during the pandemic, the feeling of isolation, how damaging that can be. And so the projects that we're building are all really focused on how design nourishes community. And one of the ways that expresses itself is that all of our projects so far have a common house. And so while each unit has its own living room and kitchen and kind of unit, there's this space where everyone can eat together. And it's very inspired by this movement of co-housing, which in Denmark, where it started, has become a very common form of housing. But basically, same idea. You have a common house where if, say it's 10 units, if each person that lives there cooks dinner once a month in the common house, you could have 3 or 4 nights a week where someone in your community is cooking a big meal, and you can eat with your neighbors, or you can take the food from there and bring it home. But it means that instead of having to cook every night, you're cooking once a month, or maybe a few nights a week if that program only exists a couple days a week in your community. And that's saving so much time. It's like one of the huge, a lot of people who live in co-housing that I know do it for the practical reasons of just having more time, and how much easier your daily life is when you're sharing a bit more of those sort of parts of, things like cooking. And then there's all the other elements. So our projects also have a shared guest room where if you live in a 1-bedroom studio or 1-bedroom unit, you might really want to be able to host visitors from out of town. And that's hard to do. And so this is just a way to kind of give both the common house and the guest suite are ways to bring some of the benefits of living in a larger home to people who don't have to buy a larger home. So not everyone, you don't have, if you have a guest room, you're not using it every single day. But if you're sharing that with, 4 or 5 other people, it's such a great asset to have. It's also a kind of a flexible space people can work in during the day. And then the other big piece of what we do in our projects that's important is the idea of a stoop or porch. You think of like streets that have a lot of stoops or porches feel very different than streets that just have garages facing you and front lawns. And there's actually a lot of research that shows that the amount of relationships you see on a street is very different depending on those spaces, those like porches and stoops. And part of that is that it's like this really safe space to interact on a daily basis. You don't have to go and knock on someone's door to say hi to them. You can drink your coffee on your front porch or stoop, and that kind of signals to your neighbors that like you could come say hi if you want. So creating a lot of those like balconies and stoops and porches and in between spaces for people to strike up conversation or just say hi on their way in or out of their home. Those like little everyday moments that build up into a relationship over time, to really nourish that and create opportunities for it. So that's something we put a lot of thought into in our projects as well.
Yeah. And so I'm curious how you got to this place. Like, did you grow up in an intergenerational home, or how did you feel this need, like personally?
I did. I grew up in a very unconventional home. It was a single family house in a suburb outside of Seattle. But my parents were maybe more radical than like most of my friends' parents, in that we always had other families living with us or people. And I was used to coming back from school and like some random dude being in the kitchen and just like, oh, who are you? And like we'd have visitors stay with us for long periods of time. But we also often had families where the house would always be full of people. And that continued also after I left and went to college and moved out, that my parents continued to have other people living with them in their house. So it's always been a very full home.
And was there some like organization that they met these people through, or was it just like they meet them on the street hanging out, or
it was a mix? Like they were part of a religion when I was younger that they left when I was 12 or 10 or 12. So some of it was through that, but they also, like one woman they met on the bike trail that still lives with them now. When I was 6 months old, she was like another mother to me. So kind of random, but that's just like their approach to life. And it definitely affected the way I've lived as an adult. Most of my adult life, I've lived in some form of community, in a collective or in co-housing. And it's been really just like, it's been so lovely to be a part of and to feel all the benefits that brings, especially as a parent. Like it's kind of hard to express how much of a difference it makes to not be the only adult. And during COVID, having other adults around in the community I was living in was huge. It was like, a very, very different experience, and kids around. And yeah, I just feel like our daily life can be so much richer. And a lot of the things that we fear losing from sharing a bit more are more imaginary than real. And a lot of it has to do with actually design. I think a lot of people's sense of sharing comes from living with other people in college or when we're younger, where you're all in a room in a house and there's dirty dishes in the sink and like you have to deal with that. But if you have your own actual private space and you can be alone, but you have these opportunities to opt into community, it really changes that dynamic. There's actual autonomy between each person, and then you have these places that you can share and kind of enjoy being together. But there's a lot less of the conflict and much more of the positive sides of community.
So this is kind of a funny area for me. I've lived in community for most of my life. I love it. I always have friends living with me. And I don't actually have these like aversions to dorm life or college life. It just always generally like worked out pretty well. So I'm having trouble thinking of like, what are the things that people are averse to, or what are the stereotypes they have when you're like, oh, multifamily living is so great. What are the things they come back with as to why they're afraid of it?
I think it's, I want to say first that it's a really fair and reasonable fear that people have. And we're really adamant on not actually calling what we're doing co-housing, because we've noticed that a lot of people say, oh, that seems really interesting. I'm sure it works in Seattle, but it's not for me. Like it wouldn't be relevant for me. And we actually think that if you do community design right, it really works for complete introverts or people who really are, I think the things that people are afraid of is losing privacy, like not having the ability to be alone, having to negotiate conflict over differences in lifestyle or like the ways that you approach things. And that comes a lot from like co-living, like people who share a home together, which you've had positive experiences with. I have as well. But if you haven't had those positive experiences, it's hard. Or if you've lived in shared living in environments where people are there purely for economic reasons and not for the intentionality of community.
Yeah, that would be very hard. Yeah,
which a lot of people have experienced, like having fridges where everyone labels their food and the fridge is packed with things, but it doesn't really like work because there's not that much space, and where you're kind of dealing with shared space, but not because you want it.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I think it's a really fair fear of not having privacy and not having the ability to have your autonomy, that makes it harder for people to share more. And the not having the experience of, it's kind of like, I have a 4-year-old son, and sharing is tough. Like I'm constantly trying to teach him to learn to be okay sharing his toys with friends. It's not a skill that we just get good at as we become adults. It's something that we have to continually nourish and practice. And I'm learning as an adult how to share and be better at it. And I think our living environments have kind of stifled that growth because we're also, through consumerism, we're pushed to buy all of our own things and own all of our own things. So we don't have to practice that as much. But it's something that you can learn and do more of. And it's very nourishing. It feels good too, to not own your own lawnmower, not own your own tool set, and not own all of your own, a lot of things that are repetitive to have everyone have their own of. But it takes practice and positive experiences and reinforcement that, okay, that worked out. It wasn't so scary. There wasn't as much conflict as I thought there would be. So you can lean into it more. And so we see our projects as, in some ways, like really safe spaces for people to practice that, where they don't actually have to do it. They can really stick to themselves. If they want to not interact with their neighbors, they can do that. But there's all these like really kind, gentle invitations to sharing or being like engaging with community, but there's no forcing. And I think that's really important.
Yeah. So it's designed where there's like this comfort zone, and then there's also this like stretch zone. But if you don't want to grow in that way or challenge yourself, we can always just go back to your room and your kitchen. And there's no one's dishes that are going to be in there that you didn't explicitly choose to live with.
And that's okay. That's totally okay. Like, yeah. Also, you think about the seasons of a year, sometimes you're just like feeling like being alone, and you need your own space, and you need to go into your own world for a bit. And that's okay.
Yeah. There's something about this that it just strikes me as really relevant at this time in our evolution as a society, where there's just so much conflict, like ideological conflict on the larger level, and people we're not that comfortable with it. I mean, some of it's just like horrible and no one should be comfortable with it, right? But some of it is just like, hey, these people believe things that are really different. There are ways of engaging with that. There are ways of like learning from that, but they require practice. They require like calming the nervous system. They require being able to like understand that just because someone's ideas are different doesn't mean that somebody's fundamentally wrong. There's just like this level of growth that is available to us. And it seems like what you're inviting would allow people to practice that practice the minutia of it on a daily level, and perhaps equip us to handle these like bigger, more societal level conflicts.
Yeah, I think that's true. Yeah, totally. And comfort with other ways of seeing things and the other. It's like when you can share relationships with people. I really love, I took when I was in graduate school, I took a course on negotiation and consensus building. And a woman came and spoke about how to nourish good environments for negotiation where that work across gender and racial stereotypes. And her approach was always to provide really thorough bios for people before a meeting so that she could complexify each person. And like when people say like, oh, that person also likes to whatever it might be, like build puzzles, or like they like running, or whatever sort of hobbies that they have, or things that make them who they are. It's really hard. It's a lot harder for us to put them in a category, in a box. And I think that's kind of a beautiful way of seeing like this moment of more political polarization and like social polarization, that when you complexify people, when you actually get to see that someone's humanity is much more than, their views on a certain issue, then it starts to break down the ideas that each of us have of otherness, that like, oh, if a person voted for Trump or a person did this, that they're like, I'm going to categorize them and I'm going to like put them in a box that I understand who they are and like what they are. But actually people are unbelievably more complex and there's more to them. So it's like, I hope that our projects can nourish a bit of that people can challenge each other in certain ways to change their ideas of a lot of, stereotypes or boxes they might have for people.
Yeah. And coming full circle, that's the kind of exposure and growth that is the vaccine against this whole like segregation and fear of integration, right?
Yeah, the sort of like commons, the being in public space, sharing interactions with people. When people like go in their car from their garage and drive to work and come home and they're surrounded by their little bubble of like-minded people, they don't really expose themselves to as much to other people. I think that's increasingly become a thing with the pandemic. So just opportunities to share a little bit more. Yeah. I don't know if that's an ambitious like aim for what we're doing, but that is something I believe in, like personally.
Yeah, I mean, it's the logical consequence. Like if what you're doing actually works, and 20% or 30% of people in the country live in housing cooperatives in say 30 years from now, then that would happen. It's just like it couldn't not happen, right?
It would shift something, I think. Yeah. And I think that part of, I guess, another side to the work that we're doing that I haven't spoken much to is that we're working a lot with neighborhoods as they change. So Seattle, as an example, has dramatically rezoned its single family neighborhoods, and we'll be doing more of that in the next year through another rezone. And what that does is it creates more density. It changes a neighborhood from being all single family to more dense, but that can look a lot of different ways. And a lot of the ways that it's playing out currently is getting rid of a lot of homes and building townhomes, and these townhomes that are targeting sort of the upper echelons of, like people who can buy a $1.2 million home on these lots. But density, when it's like what we see is that if it's really driven by homeowners, that they're creating the projects that, that they're driving that process of transformation and change in their neighborhoods. And a lot of the community is actually staying and is a part of that process, that it can lead to a very different outcome, and that a denser urban environment can actually be an incredibly nourishing place. Like you can have more walkability and more local economy and more diversity of uses within a street and a neighborhood, and that can be really lovely. Like that's another layer of community.
Okay, so this is maybe I don't have the background here, but my sense is that in general, you talk about a neighborhood in a city like Seattle, and the city wanting to change the neighborhood, change the zoning to allow for higher density. That's going to create a lot of resistance, and people in that neighborhood are going to be like, "You're destroying our neighborhood," and what you're offering is this like, oh, it doesn't have to be this oppositional framework, and there can be people in that neighborhood who see opportunity in that, not just like I'm going to sell my house and make a bunch of money, but there's an opportunity to create and continue creating the community we have been creating through this rezoning.
Yeah, and I think part of it is a reasonable anger. It's just like all that benefit from a rezone is usually going to developers. Like a lot of the homeowners we work with, when their lots were rezoned, their property taxes increased dramatically because they're being taxed based on
the potential.
So they're actually, and then their value of their home, like their land became worth more, but their home became worthless because Now someone's just buying the land, they're not buying the structure. So like actually what they can sell their home for is not that different than prior to the rezone for a lot of homeowners, because they're now developers just buying their land, they're not buying the structure. And so it's really hasn't been great for a lot of homeowners, that rezone, because all the benefit of that new development potential is going to someone else. They're not getting that. So we see that creating a process for homeowners to do development and for communities to do development is a way of keeping that benefit in a community and that upside in a community, and allowing it to be driven. So much of what gets built is actually determined by the source of capital. That's kind of that's a big concept, but what banks want and what banks feel is low risk. And that is a lot of what's actually driving what gets developed and built in the city. But if a homeowner is like one of the primary investors in a project, they have a very different vision than a conventional investor or bank on what they want and what to them would be valuable.
Mm-hmm.
For them, it might be more, their kids own their own home, and that their neighbors or their friends also have like a home near them, and that they don't need so much space. They're older and they want a smaller living space. They want to live close to their family and their community. So it's like a very different set of motives.
And when you've seen these kind of owner-led development models happen, is there a way of, do they remodel the house or divide the house, or do they still have to take out the house that was there?
So for our projects, two of our current projects, we are, one is on vacant land, one is on a house, a lot with a house, and the other is also with a house. One of the houses we're removing and putting in 10 new units. So that's like getting rid of the existing structure. The other, we're keeping the existing structure. It's a smaller home and it's kind of at the edge of the lot. So ideally, we would like to keep the structures where it's possible. But sometimes the homes are not in great shape. And it also, because of their placement on the lot, it really limits what you can do. So,
yeah. But
the homeowners are all part of the projects. They're all going to live there. And they're all doing it for their future community.
Awesome. Wow.
Yeah.
All right. Is there anything else we want to add? Anything I missed? Anything else you want to share?
I think that what we're trying to do is create environments that really nourish us and that are kinder. And we think of like the current economic system we're a part of feels very cold and harsh. And there's just a lot of fear about what's like, and it doesn't need to be that way. Like, it's actually, what we're doing is not that complicated. It's not that, it is hard. There's a lot of groundwork we've had to do, but the reason it's not happening more is just inertia. It's like what has been done that continues to be done. But there's so much receptiveness for what we're doing. And there's a lot of interest from the lending community and the philanthropic community and cities. Like City of Seattle has been unbelievably supportive. And yeah, I think there's a lot that's possible by just questioning the existing processes that are taking place around us, and trying out something different and learning from what's being done in other places. A lot of this has been inspired from European approaches to cooperative development, and things that have been done historically in the US, but just haven't in the last few decades. So yeah, just I really dream of kind of a kinder world for people to live in and grow old in and raise children in, that isn't so harsh. And that should be inclusive, that it must be inclusive. And yeah, it's right now there's so many people who do own homes that want to do good and don't totally know how to. And to see that the asset that they have is a huge, incredible, has so much potential to help their communities, and the people around them, and to address issues that feel really deep-rooted and impossible to touch, they can actually change those through what they do have. And it doesn't have to hurt them either. Like a lot of our homeowners are actually making more by developing their project as co-ops than they would if they sold them just to a developer. But they're getting so much more out of it. So there's just a lot, I think, that's possible when we look at when we kind of take a step back and think about how like all the mutual gains that can be out there that aren't surfaced or taken advantage of, and like coming at it from a place of trust and kindness and like hope versus fear.
I love it. And I love that it's not only just a dream, because many people have that dream, of a kinder world, but you're building it.
Trying to. Yeah. Yeah. I guess one other thing I would add is just Tamara is not on this interview. But my co-founder is a queer woman, and that a lot of our approach is because of her and things she's taught me, and that a lot of our partners and the people we work with, architects, developers, lenders, are women. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I think that there's like a huge space for development to be done by women, and I think that creates a very different world. And that touches on a lot of the themes we're talking about. And that's part of like people who have been excluded from this part that, real estate development so much historically, that when you see more people that don't look like me doing real estate development, it's that itself will lead to very different outcomes, a very different world that we live in. So that I think is also really inspiring. That's something that we're deeply care about and want to support in our work.
All right. So if people wanted to help out with this or get engaged or get involved or do something like this where they live, how's that possible? What could they do?
So we have a form on our website that homeowners can fill out, and people interested in living in one of the projects can fill out. So that's easy to do. You can also list there if there's a neighborhood you want to see a project in. The other big thing is that one of the things that makes our projects possible is impact capital. So people who want to put their money into something that is making a difference and are still getting a return. There's different ways of engaging. Some people invest for a shorter term, and it's almost like a somewhat conventional real estate investment during construction. It's more risk because it's during construction, but we're able to get 7 to 10% annual return over a 3-year period. And then people who have a bit more patient capital that are interested in kind of a lower risk investment that's more 5 to 10 years, that's towards the cooperatives after they're built. And that's like a great place to support what we're doing, is to put money people have into something that's doing good in their neighborhoods and communities. And then we're always looking for partnerships, other, architects, developers, people working in real estate that want to be involved. Our projects are possible because of the sort of network of good people that we've been working with, that we have good relationships with, and would love to continue to expand that. So please feel free to reach out to us. And we're also very much shaped by input from residents, from homeowners, from people who have their own dreams and visions for how they want to see change in their communities and neighborhoods. And so we also really love and welcome ideas and thoughts.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Josh.
Hi everyone, this is Martin San, producer, editor, and sound designer for the 10,000 Heroes Joe. I just wanted to take a minute to thank our guest for joining us, and also thank you for listening. 10,000 Heroes is brought to you by Momentum Lab. This is the team. Pierre does our artwork, DJ Plainview composed our theme music, and I handle all the editing and sound design. And now, we are closing down this episode with a word from our main sponsor, who also happens to be our host, Anchor.
Hey, everybody. Thanks again for listening. If you like this episode, there's two things I want you to do. One, introduce me to the most inspiring person you know so I can have them on the show. And two, take the next step towards us hanging out in person. Maybe that's signing up for the newsletter. Maybe that's attending an upcoming in-person or virtual event. What I'm trying to do here is destroy the basic one-to-many nature of this medium, podcast, entertainment, and replace it with something that actually builds connections between people. The beloved community, getting closer together, understanding each other, one conversation at a time. So, join me. Bye!